The grief was still fresh on my hands when he told me what was expected of me that night. We had buried my mother-in-law that afternoon. The ground was cold. The men had taken turns with the shovels the way they always do, and I had stood there in my black dress watching the dirt fall, thinking about nothing except how quiet she had become. That evening the house was full of casseroles and low voices, and when the last buggy finally rolled down the lane and the lamps were turned down low, my husband looked at me across the kitchen and said the words I had been dreading without even knowing I dreaded them. Before I tell you what he demanded of me the night we buried his own mother, you need to understand something. He was not being cruel. He believed with his whole heart that he was doing exactly what God required of him. And that is the part that still keeps me awake at night all these years later. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and now I share the stories we were never allowed to speak out loud. This channel, behind everything you think you know about plain life, is where I finally say the things my community would have shunned me for whispering. If you want to hear the truths that stay hidden behind the prayer cap, subscribe and tap that like button, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from right now. I read every single one, and I want to know who is out there listening tonight. Now let me explain what you just heard, because I know how it sounds to an outside ear. When a death happens in an Amish community, everything moves according to a rhythm that has nothing to do with your grief and everything to do with duty. The body is washed and dressed by the family, usually the women, and I was one of them. We laid Fanny out on the cooling board in the front room ourselves. There is no funeral home that comes to take your dead away. You keep them. The viewing happens right there in the house, over 3 long days, with hundreds of people filing past the plain pine coffin, and you stand beside it hour after hour, greeting each one, accepting each quiet handshake, while your own sorrow waits somewhere in the back of your throat because there is no room for it yet. And through all of it, life does not stop. The cows still need milking the morning after you close your mother-in-law's eyes. The bread still needs baking. The chickens do not know that the house is in mourning. The Ordnung, our unwritten but iron code, does not pause for sorrow. You are expected to feel your loss quietly and privately, and then keep your hands moving, because idleness is a door that pride walks through, and pride, hochmut, is the worst sin we knew. The morning after the burial, before the sun was fully up, I was already back in the barn with the milk pails, my hands moving through the same motions they had made 10,000 times before, while somewhere inside me a whole night sat unspoken and unmourned. No one asked me how I was, no one ever would. That is not coldness, you understand. It is the shape grief takes when a whole people have decided that the only proper way to carry sorrow is to carry it in silence and keep carrying everything else at the same time. Here is what people outside the community do not understand about an Amish marriage. The theology of it rests on one word above all others, and that word is submission. A wife submits. Not sometimes, not when it is convenient, not when she agrees. Always. The bishop preached it at my wedding, the same as he preached it at every wedding I ever attended. He read from the old letters about wives yielding to their husbands as unto the Lord, about the man being the head of the household as Christ is the head of the church. And a young girl of 19 sitting on a hard wooden bench in her new blue dress does not hear the fine print in those words. She does not hear the weight of the word always. She only hears that this is holy, this is God's design, and to question it is to question Him. That is how they build it into you. Not with a lock and not with a chain, but with a scripture, so that the walls of your own life feel like the walls of heaven itself. I married Amos when I was 19. He was 24, steady, hard-working, a man who could fix anything with an engine or a hoof and never say more than 10 words doing it. Our courtship had been gentle. We bundled the way young people did, lying together on top of my quilt in the dark, fully clothed, talking for hours in Pennsylvania Dutch about the farm we would build, the cows we would buy, and the children we hoped God would send. He was kind to me then. He brought me a carved wooden spoon he had made himself, and I kept it in my hope chest like it was gold. I want you to hold on to that image of him, because the man I am telling you about was not a monster. He was a product of the same silence that raised me, and I have spent a long time learning how to hold both of those truths in the same two hands. His mother, Fanny, was a hard woman, but a fair one. She never warmed to me the way I hoped a mother-in-law might, but she taught me to quilt with tighter stitches than my own mother ever had, and she never once raised her voice to me in 7 years of living just across the yard. When she got sick that autumn, it went fast. A cough, then a fever, then a stillness that settled over the whole household like snow. We nursed her at home because that is what we do. There are no nursing homes in our world, no hospice nurses coming up the lane. The family carries the dying the same way it carries the newborn, with its own 2 hands, through every long night. I sat with her the last 3 of them. Toward the end she took my hand and called me by her own daughter's name, and I did not correct her. When she passed, it was on a gray Tuesday morning with the frost still on the window, and I was the one who closed her eyes. The funeral was 3 days later. Nearly 400 people came from 3 church districts, filling the barn and spilling out into the yard. The service ran for hours on those hard benches, the bishop preaching not about the woman we had lost, but about submission to God's will, about accepting what is given and what is taken, about the smallness of our own wants against the vastness of His plan. Roast chicken and mashed potatoes and choufle pie for hundreds afterward. My cheeks ached from being composed. We rode to the burial ground in a long line of black buggies, the horses' breath steaming in the cold. I watched them lower her into the earth. I watched my husband's jaw stay perfectly still, because a man does not weep where others can see him, and neither does his wife. And that night, when the house was finally empty and dark and the last dish had been dried and put away, he told me what he expected. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you what I am allowed to tell you, because it matters just as much. What Amos demanded of me that night was not born of malice. It was born of a belief so old and so deep that no one in his life had ever thought to question it. In our community, there was a teaching passed quietly from the older men to the younger ones, the same way the women passed their own secret knowledge over fences and at quilting bees. It moved sideways, in whispers, the way forbidden knowledge always moves. The teaching was this: a wife's duty to her husband does not pause for grief. It does not pause for sickness. It does not pause for death, not even the death of his own mother. In fact, the men were taught that in the hardest hours, a wife's yielding was a comfort ordained by God, a way of turning a husband's sorrow back toward life and away from despair. Her own sorrow was never part of the equation. Her own exhaustion, her own grief, her own body that had spent 3 days washing and dressing and sitting up with the dead, none of it entered into the arithmetic of what she owed. The ledger only ran one way. So when Amos looked at me that night, hollow-eyed and grieving, and told me he needed me to be a wife to him, he was not reaching for cruelty. He was reaching for the only comfort his faith had ever given him permission to want. And I, standing there still in my funeral black, my own heart cracked wide open, understood in that moment that there was no version of this evening where my grief counted for anything at all. His need was a command from God. Mine was not even a whisper. It did not have a name. And a thing with no name, in our world, is a thing that does not exist. I want to tell you about my friend Rebecca, because she is the reason I finally understood that this was not just my own private sorrow. Rebecca married at 18, 2 years before me. When her own father died, she buried him on a Thursday, and by that same night her husband expected the same of her, exactly the same. She told me this years later in her pantry, kneading bread with her hands so we would look busy if anyone walked in on us. She said she had lain there afterward staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was wicked for feeling like something had been taken from her on the very day she had already lost so much. She had no words for it. Neither did I. We had both been raised to believe that a feeling with no name is a feeling that does not exist, and so we both went on for years believing the ache was proof of some private failing in us, some crack in our faith that a better woman would not have had. I have thought many times since about how much of a woman's real life in that world happens in the pantry, in the wash house, in the space of a few stolen minutes with flour on her hands, because those were the only rooms where two women could speak the truth to each other without a man or a bishop hearing it. Whole marriages, whole grievances, whole lifetimes of quiet suffering were passed back and forth in those small stolen minutes. And then the door would open, and the faces would smooth over, and everyone would go back to being exactly who they were expected to be. And Rebecca was not the only one. There was an older woman in our district, Anna, who had been married nearly 40 years, and once at a quilting bee, without ever looking up from her stitching. She said something I did not understand until much later. She said, "A woman learns early that the safest place to keep a thing is where no one thinks to look for it, and the safest place of all is inside her own silence." At the time I thought she was talking about money, or recipes, or the little jars women passed over fences. Now I know she was talking about grief, about all of it, about everything we carried that we were never allowed to set down. That is the great trick of the silence I grew up inside. It does not forbid you from feeling. It simply refuses to give you the language. And a woman with no words for her own pain will spend years, sometimes a whole lifetime, believing the pain is her own failing. Rebecca thought her faith was too weak. I thought mine was. Anna, I think, had simply stopped thinking about it at all, the way you stop noticing a sound you have heard every day of your life. Neither of us understood that the problem was never our faith. The problem was a system that had decided, generations before we were born, that a woman's inner life was the one thing not worth protecting. Amos was not a talker. Most of the men in our world are not. But some weeks after the funeral, I did something I had never done before in 7 years of marriage. I told him. We were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp between us throwing long shadows the way it does, the clock ticking on the wall, and I said the words I had rehearsed for days, and they still came out crooked. I told him that the night we buried his mother, something in me had broken that had nothing to do with her passing. He looked at me for a long moment, and I braced myself for anger, or for scripture, which in our world can be the same thing. And then he said the thing I did not expect. He said no one ever told me it could be otherwise. He said he had watched his own father, and his father before him, and he had simply done what men did. It had never once occurred to him that I might have carried a grief of my own that night, a grief that deserved a night of stillness. We sat in that silence for a long time. The horses shifted in the barn. And I understood, looking at him across that lamp, that he was as much a prisoner of the Ordnung as I was. The difference was only that his prison came with the keys, and he had never once been told that he was holding them. I do not tell you this to excuse him. There is no theology on this earth that requires a grieving woman to set aside her own mourning to serve someone else's. There is no scripture that makes a wife's body a public utility of the household, to be drawn upon regardless of what she has just endured. But I tell you about that conversation because it was the most honest half-hour of our entire marriage, and it happened only because I finally broke the silence that both of us had been taught to protect with our very lives. One sentence. That was all it took to crack it open. One sentence that I had been too afraid to speak for 7 years. When I left the community at 26, the cost came quickly, the way it always does. The shunning settled over me like winter, and it has never fully thawed. My letters home were returned unopened, the envelopes marked in my own mother's hand. She would not speak to me on the phone the one time I tried. My father's door, the door of the house I was born in, the house where I learned to walk and to pray, and to keep my sorrows to myself, closed to me for good. That is the price of the truth in our world, and I paid it knowing exactly what it would cost me, and I would pay it again. It was in therapy, years later, that I first heard the words I had spent my whole life without: autonomy, consent, boundaries. 3 words, and each one landed on me like a stone dropped into still water. My therapist listened to me describe that night, and the nights that came after, and she said something I have thought about every single day since. She said, control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears the face of duty. Sometimes it calls itself God's will so that no one, not even the person enforcing it, ever has to notice it is control at all. I sat in her office and I wept. Not for the girl in the black dress standing in that dark kitchen, though I wept for her too, but for every woman in every plain house who is standing there right now, tonight, with no word for what is happening to her and no one to tell her that a word even exists. For a long time after I left, I was angry at Amos, and then for a while I was angry at myself for not being angrier, and then slowly the anger settled into something quieter and heavier and harder to name. Because the truth is that there was no single villain in that dark kitchen. There was a boy who had been handed a set of rules he never chose, and a girl who had been handed a silence she never chose, and a scripture that had been bent over centuries into a shape that served everyone in the household except the woman holding it all together. I still have that carved wooden spoon. It came with me when I left, one of the only things I took. Some nights I hold it and I think about the boy who made it, and the man he became, and the two of them do not fit together the way I once believed they would. That is the thing no one warns you about. It would be so much easier if the people who hurt you were only ever cruel. It is the kindness, mixed in with the harm, that takes the longest to make peace with. When I finally understood that, the anger did not disappear. It simply grew up. It stopped looking for a person to blame and started looking at the whole machine, and that is a far lonelier thing to be angry at, because a machine cannot ask you for forgiveness, and it cannot say it is sorry. The Amish world gave me things I will carry to my grave. A community so close it has a weight you can lean on. A faith that, wounded as it is, still lives somewhere deep inside me. Hands that know how to work, and a spine that knows how to endure almost anything. But it also handed a 19-year-old girl a lifelong promise she had no way of understanding, and then told her that her own grief was a form of selfishness, and her own body was never fully her own. That is not holiness. That is silence dressed up in Sunday clothes, and I spent half my life mistaking one for the other. If you grew up in a place where your own sorrow was treated as an inconvenience to someone else's needs, I see you. If you were ever made to believe that yielding was the same thing as loving, and that having needs of your own was the same thing as sin, you are not alone, and you were never wrong. I was not too weak to be a good wife. I was too unheard to be a whole person. And the difference between those two things took me half my life to learn. And it is the difference I would give anything to have known on the night we buried her. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.